With the Synod of Bishops only a month away, Pope Francis made an apostolic visit to Mongolia last week. Now, Mongolia has a very tiny Catholic population, but its location in East Asia between Russia and China make it geopolitically significant. Pope Francis did manage to make headlines, even if he visited a very small Catholic population. Here with analysis is the editor of Catholic World News, visiting fellow at New Hampshire's Thomas More College, Philip Lawler. Philip, thanks for being here. I want to start with Pope Francis's comments about his wishes for the Chinese people. Now, this was interesting. On Sunday at Mass, flanked by the Bishop Emeritus of Hong Kong, as well as the current bishop, he said this: "These brother bishops to Chinese people, be good Christians and good citizens." Now, Phil, can one be a good Christian and a good citizen in China, given the reality on the ground there today? And what do you make of this exhortation by the Pope?
Well, at best, it's awfully difficult to be a good citizen of a Chinese communist regime and a good Catholic at the same time. But you have to see this comment in context of the fact that the Chinese government is involved in what they call the Sinicization of the Catholic Church. That is making the church loyal to the Chinese regime at the expense of loyalty to the universal church. And so that redoubles the difficulty of being a good citizen and a good Catholic. You also have to bear in mind that this same Chinese regime that they're being asked to obey, and that's what it is, it's obedience to the regime. This same regime refused to give permission for any of the bishops from mainland China to go to Mongolia to meet with the Pope. And that tells you something about the attitude of that regime and the corresponding, well, frankly, the weakness of the reaction from the Roman pontiff to what's at best a disrespectful attitude towards the Vatican.
Yeah, well, and a murderous attitude toward the faithful in China. But on Monday, on the papal plane back to Rome from Mongolia, Pope Francis addressed this China situation again. He insisted that relations between the Vatican and China are going very well. He said this, quote, "Relations with China are very respectful. Personally, I have great admiration for the Chinese people. They are very open people. There is a commission to nominate bishops that works in collaboration between the Chinese government and the Vatican. A dialogue has been open for a long time. I think we have to move forward in the religious aspect to understand each other more so that Chinese citizens do not think the church does not accept their culture and their values, and that the church represents another foreign power. This friendly road is well traveled by the commission, chaired by Cardinal Pietro Parolin. They are doing a good job, even the Chinese side, a good job," end quote. Phil, can you decode that? And what of the news that the Vatican and China have this apparently long-standing commission to appoint bishops?
Well, let me pick out a couple of phrases from that statement by Pope Francis. One is when he said, the relations have been very respectful or are very respectful. Well, they're very respectful in one direction. The Vatican has been very respectful of Beijing. It is not mutual. And then I want to just sort of put a pin in another thing where he said we have to move forward, because I think we're going to be talking about moving forward later in this broadcast, in this conversation, in another context. But when he talks about the commission, there is a secret agreement between Beijing and Rome regarding the appointment of bishops. We don't know what that agreement stipulates. Apparently, there's a commission to appoint bishops. Here's the problem. They haven't been appointing bishops. It's very, very slow going. The most recent appointment of a new diocesan bishop in China was the Bishop of Beijing, who was transferred from another diocese without any approval of, apparently without any notice to the Vatican that it was going to happen. So that is hardly respectful. The same Cardinal Parolin said it looks as if the Chinese government, the Chinese regime, is simply ignoring the terms of the agreement. This is not respectful, and it's not helpful, and it's not productive.
Phil, what's amazing to me is the deference and the kindness and the gratuitous signs of respect, even the blessing of essentially Xi and his commandants being adjunct members of the Congregation for Bishops in Rome. That's what this amounts to. The Pope is giving his blessing to this adjunct Chinese a commission on bishops apart from the Vatican. And what do you make of the Pope's suggestion here? That the Chinese people are concerned about the church representing another foreign power, and somehow the Chinese people are the ones that need to be placated and calmed down.
Yeah, well, of course, frankly, that is the Chinese government's propaganda line. And it's been the propaganda line through the ages of practically every regime that's at odds with the church, that the church is a foreign power, and that Catholics in whatever country it is, in this case, China, should be suspicious of the church, of the universal church. That's not an attitude of loyal Catholics. That's an attitude of communists. And it's frankly frightening to see it coming out of the mouth of the successor to St. Peter.
I want to move on to comments the Pope made about the upcoming Synod of Bishops on synodality. Pope Francis was asked about a new book by Cardinal Raymond Burke called The Synodal Process. Now, in it, Burke refers to that synodal process as a Pandora's box that could cause calamity and confusion. Pope Francis reacted this way, quote, "But if you go to the root of these ideas, you will find ideologies. Always, when one wants to detach from the path of communion of the church, what always pulls it apart is ideology. And they accuse the church of this or that, but they never make an accusation of what is true. It is made up of sinners. They never speak of sin. They defend a doctrine like distilled water that has no taste and is not true Catholic doctrine. That is in the creed, and that very often scandalizes." Phil, we could spend a half hour just unpacking this, but I mean, the idea that a doctrine, is somehow, if it's not in the creed, then it's not Catholic doctrine. I don't know where that comes from or who devised that, but I'll move past that for a moment. What of this concern for ideologies? Isn't ideology driving this entire synod? Sex and gender and women's rights, and I mean, isn't that a part of this?
That's a huge part of it. In fact, I'm thinking if I could be known for one law, the Lawler's law would be when the other side starts accusing you of something, take a careful look, because that's probably exactly what they're doing. This is an ideological synod. It is dominated by feminism, by gender ideology creeping into the Catholic Church. It is not a synod on synodality. It is not about the question, the very important question, of how the Catholic Church should make decisions about the relationship between the College of Bishops and the Petrine Ministry. It has devolved into a discussion of all the latest liberal hot-button issues, such as blessing for same-sex marriage and ordination of women and climate change and so forth. It is an ideological gathering, and the notion that Cardinal Burke, for instance, is motivated by ideology is as absurd as the idea that he never talks about sin.
No, and I, while you mentioned Cardinal Burke, I'm going to mention this Washington Post article that showed up the other day. It reads, the headline, "Pope Francis chides his U.S. critics, but whom does he have in mind?" And the writer, Jack Jenkins, I love this little disclaimer. In the middle of the piece, Phil, he says, "Before we move on, a few personalities on the Catholic scene whom Francis may or may not have in mind." So, and I'm listed, Tim Bush is listed, Bishop Strickland. Amazingly, Cardinal Burke didn't make the list, and neither did you. But it's clear from what I'm seeing in the press, they are making this public enemies list of anybody who dares question what's about to happen at this synod. You're somehow a bad person, and we need to call you out. Public enemy number one. This is silly stuff. I mean, if they think nobody's reading the Washington Post, first of all, more people are hearing this than read the Post. But it is interesting that you see these columns coming out, basically ad hominems and dumb attacks on people of real substance in some cases, theologians and holy men and women across the spectrum.
Right. And obviously, they may or may not be the people that Pope is thinking about. They're the people Jack Jenkins is thinking about, for sure. And it's open season now for a lot of liberal commentators to do things like that, to say, well, you're beyond the pale. We can't talk to you. You're one of these radical ideological Catholics. And you notice, by the way, in all of this discussion, there's no debate on the substance of the issues. Cardinal Burke is suggesting that there is a problem that we could have a runaway synod. Well, the way you answer that concern, if you're really sincere about it, is you say, no, we're not going to have a runaway synod. We're going to control it to the issues on the agenda and look what's on the agenda. And then, of course, you have a problem because these issues are on the agenda.
Right. Well, this is the whole problem. You're right. No one will talk about the substance, and it's ad hominem silly attacks based on he interviewed that person and he knew that person. And I mean, this is crazy. It's slanderous, and it's attacking people's reputations without engaging the argument because you can't. Phil, also on the papal plane, Francis was asked about the synodal discussions and whether they would be held in open. Pope Francis said this, here's the quote, "On the process of the assembly, there is one thing that we must safeguard, the synodal atmosphere. This is not a television show where you talk about everything. No, there is a religious moment. There is a moment of religious exchange. Without this spirit of prayer, there is no synodality. It becomes politics and parliamentarianism. The synod is not a parliament. Regarding the privacy of discussions, there is a department headed by Dr. Ruffini, that's the media office at the Vatican, who is here and who will issue press releases about this regarding the synod progress. In a synod, it is necessary to safeguard religiosity and safeguard the freedom of those who speak." Now, Phil, what do you make of a moment, an event, billed as listening to the voices of the whole church, now held in private with an invite-only group of people who are of like mind?
Well, it's contradictory, but then it's not the first contradiction. This has been from the get-go a synod that is advertised as being open to everybody, but in practice, the people who are invited, the people who are sort of let through the various filters, the people who are invited, who are involved in writing up the preparatory documents, that's all fairly tightly controlled. And this synod, frankly, like every synod before it, will be more tightly controlled. The restrictions on press access or public access, to me, are most significant because the last few synods have seen outbursts. The one most dramatic, I wish I'd been there, was Cardinal Pell, the late Cardinal Pell, slamming down something on his desk and saying, "You must stop manipulating this synod." That doesn't make good TV for the people who are trying to control the process.
Right. Yeah. And I was about to ask you, why can't the church hear and watch these discussions if this synod is so important, so seminal? And look, if we're worried about protecting religious moments and moments of prayer, if that's what this is, then we should stop broadcasting papal events and all those papal meetings. Those are allegedly religious moments too, right?
Of course. And what I don't understand this. Are you afraid, if you want a prayerful atmosphere, are you afraid of the public seeing people in a prayerful atmosphere? I don't understand that concern at all.
Yeah, I think you're right. They're afraid of seeing any break in the narrative that's being advanced here. And Phil, the Relator General of the Synod, Belgium Cardinal Jean-Claude Holrich, he defended this week what he calls a protected space of non-public deliberations, end quote, for this synod on synodality. He said this protected space would be necessary for free debate. Why keep these discussions hidden? If they're matters of such importance, and particularly when they will greatly affect the faithful, shouldn't people be able to hear what the church is deciding for them?
Yes, and if you want the Holy Spirit to move freely, don't you want as many opportunities as possible for someone to be inspired by the Holy Spirit? It's a protected space, to me, is sort of the opposite of an openness to the Holy Spirit.
Phil, I want to get your take on a recent meeting the Pope had early in August with Jesuits during a visit to Portugal. This was just released this past week. A Portuguese Jesuit who had spent some time in the United States asked the Pope about the criticism coming from conservative and traditional Catholics and Catholic groups in the United States. Pope Francis did not mince words. He said, "Those American groups of which you speak, so closed, are isolating themselves. And instead of living by doctrine, by the true doctrine that always develops and bears fruit, they live by ideologies. But when you abandon doctrine in life to replace it with an ideology, you have lost. You have lost as in war. Phil, the Pope also laments the focus on sins of the flesh, or what he called sins below the waist, over social justice concerns. Your reaction to these broadsides against traditional Catholics?
You notice, again, there isn't much substance. It's, I'm sorry to say, name-calling. You notice also that, once again, the Pope is talking about ideology, when, in fact, what people like us are worried about is the increasing ideological control over the agenda of the Vatican. And when he talks about pelvic issues dominating our consciousness, look at the issues that are coming up in discussions again and again and again on this Synod of Bishops, starting with homosexuality, same-sex unions, feminism, etc., abortion, it's contraception, it's the pelvic issues. If we're talking a lot about those issues, it's because somebody else opened the conversation.
Right. That was previously closed. And, it's very interesting when you look at the panoply of these issues. It seems to me traditional Catholics are concerned about the vertical. They're concerned about the Eucharist, the sacraments, reaching God. The progressives are more focused on the horizontal, all the stuff that's earthbound and pelvic, as you mentioned. And on the papal plane, Pope Francis summed up his critique this way. I want your reaction. He said about Americans, yes, they got mad, but move on. Move on. Phil, I guess those American faithful just need to get over it and follow the German church in quiet. Or maybe they should enslave, whole populations as the Chinese do, and maybe they'll be treated with a little more respect.
Or Genghis Khan, who the Pope had some praise for him while he was in Mongolia. I don't think I'll be a successor to Genghis Khan in that respect. But notice again here, he's saying move on. As I earlier highlighted, his saying move forward. It's don't look back. Don't look at what I've said that might have upset or angered or outraged or offended these loyal American Catholics. This is one of those instances where, there's a big difference between saying, I'm sorry that I offended you, and saying, I'm sorry you were offended. In the one case, you're admitting that you did something that caused offense. In this case, he is not. He's not reaching out to us. He's not reaching out to those of us on the peripheries and showing his concern and care for us. He's saying, get over it.
Yeah. Speaking of moving on, Father Antonio Spadaro, a very close confidant, indeed the ghostwriter for Pope Francis for many of his encyclicals, made some rather interesting comments regarding Christ and the woman at the well from the Gospel of Matthew. Spadaro, in what appears to be a homily in an Italian periodical, describes Jesus as, quote, indifferent and then stymied and callous regarding the woman's plight. He goes on to say Jesus' conversation with the Canaanite woman was marred by the, quote, cultural rigidity of the time. Spadaro finally argues that the woman upset Jesus' rigidity in order to convert him to himself. I'm going to read the quote. And Jesus also appears healed and in the end shows himself free from the rigidity of the dominant theological, political, and cultural elements of his time. So, Phil, I guess this is a real novel one. Even Jesus himself was rigid and in need of conversion. This is blasphemy. I don't know what else to call it.
I don't either. And we're living in an upside-down world when someone who's so closely in touch with the man on Peter's throne is giving the world this sort of, blasphemous understanding where it's not that Jesus converts people, it's that people convert Jesus. I mean, it's mind-boggling. And in a better day, in happier days, it would bring immediate consequences, negative consequences for Father Spadaro.
Well, but it's telling. I mean, I never look at what people say, Phil. I always, look at the background, look at the context, then you figure out what they're really saying. It reveals a certain hatred, indeed a disdain, a looking down upon Jesus Christ himself, who you claim to have committed your life to. I mean, look, if I work for you, if I come work for Lawler Enterprises, and then I go out and I say, you know, that Phil Lawler, he's one rigid guy. I mean, he really needs, what he really needs is a conversion. That's not respectful, loving, kind, or someone you want to model yourself after. This is, I'm just amazed at this statement. But I guess, you know, non-rigidity is the chic of the day, so we all should jump in. Phil, it was also announced recently that Pope Francis will release part 2 of his environmental encyclical Laudato Si on October 4th. I know you're awaiting that drop any moment. I know you've been sitting at the computer waiting. The feast day of St. Francis. Laudato Si was first released in 2015. Its focus was care for our common home, the environment. Why do you think we need a sequel to the original? And is this an indication of where the Pope would like to take the Synod?
Well, to the latter question, yes. The Pope obviously wants climate change is very much near the top of his agenda. And if I know you read the material coming out of the Vatican every day, as I do, and so much of it is about climate change. To the first question, you want to know why we need another encyclical to follow up on the first one, which is already one of the longest encyclicals ever written. I can't answer that question. I don't feel that need. Maybe you do.
I'll have you back to summarize it. Give us the cliff notes for the audience in October. Phil, in late August, Pope Francis chose a pro-abortion, pro-LGBT Argentinian judge to head a new Vatican Institute for Social Doctrine. Former Supreme Court Justice Raul Eugenio Zafar. He was chosen to lead the newly created body that will deal with social justice and colonialism. Now, this gentleman has been accused of renting out apartment property he owned to a brothel. He exempted a pedophile from prison time. The list goes on. I don't want to get too graphic here, but what does this appointment tell us? Again, this man was hand-selected by the Pope.
It tells us about the Pope's priorities, and it tells us that these issues that should be disqualifying for anyone just don't figure very prominently in the Pope's priorities and in what considerations he weighs when he chooses someone for an important position like this. Why does he choose this man? It has to be because he's ideologically compatible on other issues. I bet you would find that he's okay with the Pope on climate change, for instance. Mm-hmm. It's a blindness. And it's a blindness that we've seen before, and we've seen it carried out in the Pope's complete change of the Pontifical Academy for Life, which is now very much concerned with, guess what? Climate change. So it's an ideology.
Wow. Before we go, I want to get your reaction to a story we've been following, the residential schools controversy in Canada. For 2 years, we've been reading really horrendous, salacious stories about hundreds of First Nations children allegedly buried en masse in unmarked graves by individuals who ran these Catholic institutions. There have been apologies issued, etc. Excavations at the sites of these institutes have been ongoing, Phil, and to date, they've recovered 0 human remains. Phil, the question is, how did these accusations come to be, and why have they persisted for so many years without any evidence? Who's been pushing this narrative?
It's an anti-Catholic narrative, and it's open season on the Catholic Church in Canada and in many other places, but it's pretty advanced in Canada. And you've had a political movement, the thrust of which is to blame the Catholic Church for all the ills of the residential schools. And the residential schools definitely had problems. I'm sort of appalled by the history of them myself. But let's keep in mind how they were established. They were established by the Canadian government, which handed them over to religious congregations to run them, and then didn't give them enough money to work with. So yes, there was inadequate food, inadequate housing, inadequate everything. Maybe inadequate burials. There may have been mass graves. I don't know. But to pin all of the blame on the Catholic Church and then to insinuate that Catholic religious were murdering children and burying them in unmarked graves is libelous. And it's very frustrating to me that we've had no pushback from the Catholic leadership in Canada, but merely apologies.
Yeah, and it should be noted that First Nations officials have never said there were mass graves at those sites, which is, it does beg the question, where did this story come from and who's interested in pushing it?
A good question. No friends of mine, no friends of the church, and apparently no friends of truth.
Yeah. Phil Lawler, we will leave it there. Thank you so much as always. Catholic World News editor Phil Lawler's reporting and commentary can be found at catholicculture.org. Thank you, Phil.
Thank you.